bring in independent Senator Angus King of Maine. Also with us, NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent and host of KCDC on MSNBC, Casey Hunt. Elise Jordan and Nick Confessori are back with us as well. Senator King, Mitch McConnell has, I think, 3 senators at this point defect so far and call for an end to the shutdown. How many is it going to take for this president to realize this is a no-win battle?
Well, of course, it only takes one more to get to a majority in the Senate. But if you're talking about a veto, then it takes a lot more. And this problem could be solved very simply by 2/3 majorities in both houses. There are underlying institutional issues here that this is not only about a wall, but it's about a president that doesn't seem to realize that there are constraints on what he can do. He can't build a wall. And there are constraints in the Constitution, in the theory of this country, and that's really what's more deeply at stake here. If he is able to extort a policy that he wants out of the Congress that isn't popular in the country based upon holding the government hostage, literally, that's what we're talking about, then it'll happen again and again and again. There has to be, and that's why I think this is such going to be a difficult message, because we just can't let that happen. This is what the framers were worried about, was an executive that overreached and tried to act like a monarch. That was what the Constitution was all about in 1787.
Do you have examples of constituents who are being hurt by the shutdown, or what have you heard about its impact?
Well, it's starting to come through to regular people. And by the way, we always talk about the 800,000 federal employees. There are probably another 500,000 or more contractors who service various government agencies. They're going to be hit by this. And once it's settled, they're not going to get back pay. So they're in the crosshairs. We've got Acadia National Park up in Maine. All the parks are open, but they're not being managed, if you will. And that's one of the ridiculous things about this. Let's pass the funding bills for things like the national parks, the Treasury Department, that have nothing to do with border security, nothing to do with the wall. Let's pass those, get that out of the way, and then set aside the Department of Homeland Security and argue about the wall. And I've got to say, by the way, apropos of nothing we've been talking about, there's nobody in the Congress who's for open borders. I'm so tired of hearing you're either for the wall or you're for open borders. That's nonsense. Everyone is for good border security. We're just not for border security that doesn't make either economic or practical sense.
Senator, it's great to have you up here in New York.
We're glad to be here.
Good to have a little bit of Maine wisdom here in Gotham City. I want to just go back to something you just said a second ago, just to clarify it. You said you were talking about this kind of action that Trump's holding hostages, basically, the government, and that kind of this.
It reminds me of a guy that walks into the store and says, "You got a nice little store here. It'd be a shame if you had a fire.
Right.
You got a nice little government here. We're going to put it out of business."
So you're using the language of the metaphor of hostage taking. You just said this was some of the framers. This kind of thing was the thing the framers were concerned about. You invoked the word tyranny. Now, you're not Nancy Pelosi. You're not a California liberal in the characterization of conservatives. You're an independent senator from Maine who caucuses with Democrats, right? Is Nancy Pelosi right that this is a moral issue? This is not a political issue. This is a moral issue. It sounds like your language suggests that that's where you're at too.
I've got to make clear. I don't understand her saying that it's immoral. I didn't get that. I don't see it that way. Right. I think it's doesn't make sense. It's uneconomic. There are lots of places where we don't need a big wall. I think there are all kinds of problems with it. What I'm talking about, though, is the deeper institutional issue of a president who basically says, I can do whatever I want, and anybody that gets in my way, I'm going to bully them in some way. In this case, holding up the jobs and functioning of the entire U.S. government.
So you think not compromising even a little bit on this issue is a matter of principle. If not morality, it's a matter of principle that Trump cannot win on this issue.
Well, I think it's a matter, I do think that there are principles involved in it, but I do think there always is going to be a way out. He's going to declare victory no matter how this ends. So let's talk about, for example, there are places along the border where a wall makes sense. And in fact, there is one. I've seen it in southern Texas. And so let's say there are places where we can build a wall. One of the problems, John, is we've never been given a plan that I know of. Where do you need wall? Where do you need fence? Where do you need sensors? There's no, the wall has become this mythic entity, right. But we've never been told, what are you really talking about here? Because there may be places where everybody will agree, yeah, a wall makes sense there. But the problem is he's styling this as, you know, is the wall or nothing, and we're going to keep the government closed. That's not the way we make policy in this country.
Well, and the problem, Kasie Hunt, is his style is to lie and to bully and to not be trusted. So the question is, what's the wiggle room that Democrats would offer in any scenario with this president on the wall? Because I would think that would be incredibly risky. He is proven to be unpredictable and to not care. If he's agreed to something in a room, he'll walk out of the room and say something completely different. What are you hearing about how Democrats are approaching this?
You mentioned that trust issue, and I think that's really at the root of all of this. And it may actually have more to do with Republicans than with Democrats, because Vice President Pence went up to Capitol Hill and assured everybody that the president was on board with the bill that was passed right before Christmas that would have averted this entire crisis. Mitch McConnell goes out in public in front of the microphones and says, I'm confident that we're not going to have a government shutdown. And then it turns out, you know, a day later that the president just absolutely humiliates him in public and says, no, actually, that's not what I'm going to do. And that, you know, Mitch McConnell's been saying, look, I'm not going to put these House bills on the floor if the president's not going to sign them. People have read that as he's kowtowing to the president. I read it as, you know, how can he trust the president again? I mean, he got really burned. And Senator King, I'm curious, there's been some reporting about McConnell's involvement in these negotiations or lack thereof. And what is your perception of how this is being worked out? And do you think that, you know, his sort of lack of engagement in this process is something that's really hindering everything?
Well, my understanding is, just as you stated it, that he has not been engaged. And he said this on the floor publicly. Basically, he said on the floor, I'm washing my hands of this. This is between the Democrats and the president. Come back to me with an agreement that the Democrats can accept and that the president will sign, and we're good. And so he has essentially stayed out of it until this point. I don't think that's sustainable, particularly as we're seeing 2 or 3 of his Republican senators saying, let's get this over with, and if that starts to expand, then he's going to have to be involved. He is a deal maker. He's been adept in the past of finding compromise and working with people to find a compromise. But basically, I think what he said, exactly what you said, he got burned. He said, look, I'm not going to get involved in these negotiations because I can't rely on the president to back me up if a deal is struck.
So, Peter, this wall has been called a metaphor, it's been called a symbol, it's been called a bad idea. But tell us about your reporting about how it got started in the beginning.
Right. Well, at first, actually, it was sort of a mnemonic device for advisors to President Trump's campaign way back in 2014, 2015, to make sure he would talk about immigration on the campaign trail. It was something that they knew would be a visceral appeal to him, a developer, a real estate guy. You talk about a wall or something he can get his fingers on. And so they use this as a way of getting him to address the issue on the campaign trail. Once he gets out there, of course, he finds that it's a real hit at his rallies. The chant becomes "Build the wall, build the wall." It's something people can understand, they viscerally get. As one of his biographers told us, you know, you could sort of see President Trump hearing the beep, beep, beep of the concrete trucks, you know, backing up and putting the cement down. So it sort of took outsized importance. And if you talk to a lot of immigration activists, hardliners who want who think that immigration is out of control in this country, both legal and illegal, this is not the #1 priority for them. There are a lot of other things that they think would be more important toward shutting down that pipeline, but it has taken on the sort of be-all, end-all quality that it has because it was such a central part of his campaign.
But Peter, this is what is so hard to figure out when you're looking at the Republicans' actions and what they're doing. This is an idea during the middle of the campaign when Donald Trump was talking about building a wall. If you looked at Pew polls and polls from other organizations, that 2/3 of Americans were against. Now here we are in the government shutdown. 3/4 of Americans are against shutting down the government to build this wall. I'm just, again, I keep trying to figure out what is the end game for the Republican Party, who will tell you and tell me and tell anybody who will listen that they understand that this was just a campaign punchline for Donald Trump. And they understand that it's nothing but symbolism. At what point, I mean, do you see anybody in the party standing up and trying to take a leadership role here against the president, say enough is enough? We can't destroy our Senate majority too, following this guy down a rabbit trail?
Well, there are some advisors around the president who tell him that he doesn't have to worry quite so much about the base, abandoning him if for some reason the wall doesn't get built or if for some reason there's some compromise in regards to the wall. Because, in fact, they argue that he has their trust and faith already, that they actually believe he is fighting for the things that they believe in. And if it doesn't turn out to be exactly the way it sounded on the campaign trail, they'll still stand by him because they see him as sharing their values and their fears and their concerns about the border. So there are those who are telling him he has more wiggle room there than he might think. But for the moment, he doesn't seem to look at it that way. For the moment, he sees this as a sine qua non of his presidency. If he doesn't get the wall, it means he didn't succeed.
Senator, something you said earlier struck me. You said that it's not like everyone in Congress is for Democrats or for open borders. And you agree that there are areas that could use some kind of wall function on the southern border. Is part of the problem that the Trump White House just can't produce a plan as to specifics of what they want and where in spots that really need fortification, for instance, but not getting into a sweeping over 2,000-mile wall that strikes water issues and eminent domain?
Eminent domain.
Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly the point. I mean, a 2,000-mile wall, I mean, John Kelly, I think, said it won't be 2,000 miles. The trouble is we don't really know what they're talking about when they say that. I think there ought to be some kind of blue ribbon commission, if you will. I hate to use that term, but somebody come up with what makes sense along the border to secure it. Everyone in the Senate has voted for strong border security at one time or another. I did. All the members of the Democratic caucus did back in 2013. So everybody's in favor of it. It's just a question of how do you do it as a practical matter and what makes the most sense. In some places, a wall makes no sense whatsoever. It would be eminent domain, taking Americans' land, cutting them off from the Rio Grande River, all of those negatives. You could do it with fences or sensors or drones or people, technology. You need smart border security, not just building something that'll cost $20 million a mile. And, think what you could do with that money in other ways. So you're exactly right. Let's start with the fact, here's something we've lost in all of this. Half the illegal aliens in the country have come here on legal visas and overstayed them. The wall has zero to do with that. The other problem that we're now dealing with in the border is asylum seekers who come to ports of entry. They give themselves up. They're not trying to sneak across the border, swim across the river. So the wall has nothing to do with them. It's a 1985 solution to a 21st century problem, and it's not the right solution. So let's talk about what the real problems are. How do we deal with them? Where should we put the funds? By the way, the $5 billion isn't the issue. It's the wall, which, as I keep saying, isn't the right solution.
Well, and you, Senator, you say it's a 1985 solution. I actually think the Chinese thought of it a couple thousand years ago, to 2,500
and
years
Emperor
ago.
Hadrian, the Roman Emperor Hadrian's wall.
Yes. Yeah. Well, so here we are in 2019, and the president, speaking of national security, has sent troops down to guard a border for a non-existent caravan, non-existent invasion, and yet he's talking about ripping troops out of Syria, which of course would give a great advantage to the Russians, to the Iranians, and to ISIS, allow them to rebuild there. Right now, it's hard to read the tea leaves. The president said the troops were going to leave. Then he said, well, we're not going to take them out all at once. Now we hear that the National Security Advisor John Bolton is assuring allies like Israel that we're not going to be abandoning that region. Do you have any more insight than we do about what the president's plans are in Syria, and what do you think they should be?
Well, it's the best example I can think of in a long time of the old maxim, ready, fire, aim. The president fired, by saying unilaterally we're going to pull the troops out, we're going to pull them out now, we're going to get them out, and that's it. And then John Bolton today, or over the weekend, is doing the aiming part, which should have been done months ago, about the conditions-based leaving, reassuring our Kurdish allies, reassuring the Israelis, frankly, telling the Russians and the Iranians you're not going to have a free playground there. And that should have been the way this was handled in the first place. The thing that worried me the most about it, and by the way, there was a bipartisan letter that went to the White House back in December. Myself, Jeanne Shaheen, Marco Rubio, Joni Ernst, Lindsey Graham, and basically saying, do what you did this weekend. I can't claim that John Bolton read our letter. Maybe he did. But the abandoning of the Kurds, who had been our allies, to the tender mercies of the Turks was just irresponsible and awful. That seems to be we're going to pull back. Now, we'll see what happens when John Bolton goes to Turkey today or tomorrow and deals with Mr. Erdogan, who apparently was the trigger for all this in the first place in a conversation with the president. But this just demonstrates part of the reason that you want to think about these things, consult about them. And the sad part for me this morning is that John Bolton is doing what I'm sure Secretary Mattis recommended, and the fact that they didn't do it is one of the reasons he resigned,
exactly.
Which is one of the tragedies of this administration and of the current moment. I don't sleep as well with Jim Mattis gone, I got to tell you.
I don't as well either. Senator Angus King, thank you. Say hi to Mary. Tell her I'm listening to my Andy Gibb record.
I'll certainly do
time.
that. And by the way, if I look familiar today, it's because I arrived at the studio without a jacket.
You look handsome.
This is Joe's jacket and tie that
I knew it. I knew it.
I thought your game was a little off. You're wearing my $25 jacket.
There you go.
All right. Peter Baker, thank you as well for your reporting.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.